The iron crucible did not breathe. It cycled. Every 30 minutes, the massive atmospheric scrubbers in Sector 9 groaned with the sound of grinding tectonic plates, exhaling a dry, recycled mist that tasted of ozone and copper. For Kaelen Voss, it was the sound of a living tomb. He adjusted his heavy inspector coat, the dark fabric stiff with layers of industrial soot and the invisible ghosts of 1,000 cargo manifolds. His boots, reinforced with magnetic treads for low-gravity work, clicked with a hollow resonance against the polished obsidian floor of the debt concourse. Kaelen was 42 years old, though the gravity wells of the outer rim had etched lines around his eyes that suggested a much longer journey. He walked with a slight limp, a souvenir from the Pathfinder days when he had been a man of action instead of a man of ledgers. Now he spent 10 hours a day pressing his sensors against vibrating bulkheads, listening for the frequency of structural failure. It was a quiet existence, a deliberate withdrawal from a world that had once demanded too much blood from his hands. The shift was over. The concourse was in its final hour of liquidation. All around him, the neon shutters of the credit stalls were sliding down with dull metallic thuds. The lights above the debt cast dimmed from a sterile white to a flat, efficient amber. Cleaning drones, shaped like skeletal spiders, began to skitter along the edges of the hall, their solvent sprayers hissing in the encroaching silence. Kaelen usually took the Highline bypass to avoid this place, but a malfunctioning lift had forced him through the belly of the market. He kept his head down, his eyes fixed on the 3-meter perimeter in front of his boots. He almost made it to the exit. A small cluster of people near the far rim gate caught the edge of his vision. It was not a crowd, just a transaction in its final ugly stage. A broker in a sharp slate-gray uniform stood beside a floating terminal, his face illuminated by the flickering data streams of the Chronos ledger. Beside him, an assistant tapped impatiently at a tablet, the blue glow reflecting off his boredom. In the center of the light stood a woman. She was a Bio-Lume. Her skin was a deep, iridescent violet, marked with intricate glowing patterns along her collarbones and wrists, the organic circuitry of her kind. Her hair was a heavy cascade of liquid emerald, reaching down to the small of her back, though it was matted with the dust of a holding cell. She wore a slip of metallic fabric, a cheap, disposable garment that barely clung to her frame, shredded at the hem. She stood perfectly still, her bare feet aligned with the seams of the floor tiles, as if she were anchoring herself to the rock. Around her neck hung a slate on a coarse fiber cord. The letters were scrawled in thick white chalk: debt settlement, contract wife, 5 Scrip. Kaelen stopped. The price was an insult. 5 Scrip was less than the cost of a recycled air filter for a single-room unit. It was less than a meal at a mid-tier canteen. The bluntness of the number hit him like a physical blow to the sternum. He felt a sudden, sharp tightening in his jaw, an old fire he thought he had extinguished years ago, flickering back to life. The broker noticed him. He squinted at Kaelen's inspector badge and the worn quality of his Pathfinder issue coat. "Evening, Inspector," the broker said, his voice smooth and devoid of empathy. "Last transaction of the cycle. Quick processing if you're looking for a companion. No prior encumbrances, full domestic authorization." Kaelen stepped into the circle of light. Up close, he could see the faint tremor in the woman's hands, though her face remained a mask of frozen pride. Her eyes were a pale, translucent teal with vertical pupils that did not track him. She was staring at a point precisely 10 centimeters above his left shoulder. "What are the conditions?" Kaelen asked, his voice sounding raspier than he intended. The assistant checked his tablet. "Family business in Sector 5 went dark last month," he said, not looking up. "High interest penalties, oxygen tax arrears, the usual downward spiral. No assets left but the biological hardware. We converted her into a liquid bond. You pay the 5 Scrip, we transfer the ghost link to your registry. She becomes your registered spouse for the duration of the debt. Legal, stamped, and irrevocable." The woman's jaw clenched. It was the only movement she made, a tiny, involuntary twitch of muscle that told Kaelen she was listening to every word, feeling every decimal point of her own devaluation. "Any medical liens?" Kaelen asked, his eyes scanning the glowing patterns on her skin. "Clean as a whistle," the broker replied, leaning against the terminal. "You control residence, work permits, and biometric access. If she's a glitch, You can refile for a dissolution fee or trade her back to the labor pool. 5 scrip is a steal, friend. Most of these looms go for double that in the upper spires. Kaelen looked at the slate again. The cord had rubbed the skin at the back of her neck red. The chalk dust had smeared against her chest, mixing with the faint, natural bioluminescence of her skin. He knew he should keep walking. His life was built on small, predictable tasks. He had spent years making himself invisible to the system. Buying a person, even to save them, was a massive, glowing target on his back. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wristcom. He opened the transfer panel. His balance was modest, the result of months of careful saving for a better air filtration unit for his apartment. He selected 5 scrip and hovered his finger over the confirmation icon. "If I don't pay, what happens to her tonight?" Kaelen asked. The broker shrugged. "Back to the holding pens. We'll recode her for the deep mine filters. Longer hours, higher radiation, less aesthetic. The ledger doesn't like idle assets." The woman's throat moved as she swallowed. Her gaze remained fixed on the air. She was waiting for the blow to fall, for the numbers to decide her fate. Kaelen felt a surge of cold fury. He remembered standing on a ridge on a distant moon, watching a village burn because a commander had decided the inhabitants were no longer cost-effective. He had promised himself he would never be a bystander to that kind of logic again. He tapped the screen. The terminal chimed, a soft electronic bell that sounded like a funeral knell. The registry panel flashed a vibrant green. "Transfer received," the assistant muttered, finally showing a spark of interest. "Name for the bond entry?" "Kaelen Voss," he said. The machine captured his voice, processing the phonetics into the permanent record. The light on the panel shifted, and the broker turned toward the woman. "Name again for the record," the broker commanded. "Vespera," she said. Her voice was low, a jagged edge of sound that suggested she hadn't used it for a long time. "Of the Sapphire District." The registry logged it. A warm, prickling sensation spread under the skin of Kaelen's inner wrist. He looked down and saw a new symbol appear beside his ID, a thin, interlocking circle. On Vespera's collarbone, the glowing blue pattern pulsed once, then settled into a steady, muted hum. "Bond confirmed," the broker said, already folding his terminal. "Spouse registration complete. Asset moved to your ledger. Good luck, Inspector. Don't let her leak too much data." The 2 men walked away without a second glance, their footsteps fading into the shadows of the concourse. The cleaning drones moved closer, their sensors redlining as they approached the spot where the transaction had occurred. Kaelen stood in the silence, the weight of the situation settling onto his shoulders like a leaden cloak. He turned to the woman, to Vespera. She was still standing with her feet aligned to the tiles. "May I?" Kaelen asked, gesturing toward the chalk slate. She didn't answer, but she didn't pull away. He stepped into her personal space, the scent of her hitting him, a mix of ozone, sterile soap, and something like crushed flowers. He reached behind her neck, his blunt fingers fumbling with the knot of the cord. His knuckles brushed her skin, and he felt her shiver. It was the first sign of life he had seen from her. He loosened the knot and lifted the slate away. He walked to the nearest recycling chute and dropped it in. The sound of the wood hitting the metal depths was a clean, sharp crack. "You are not property," Kaelen said, his voice steady. "You are not a debt anymore." Vespera finally turned her head. Her teal eyes searched his face, her pupils narrow slits in the amber light. She looked at the mark on his wrist, then back at him. "You just paid 5 scrip for a line on your skin," she said, her voice dripping with a bitter, defensive poison. "That sounds a lot like ownership from where I'm standing, ground pounder." "I paid so someone else couldn't," he replied. "That line can be a shield. It doesn't have to be a leash." She didn't look convinced. She looked exhausted. The tremor in her hands had grown into a full-body shake now that the immediate threat of the auction was over. Kaelen took off his heavy coat and held it out to her. "Put this on," he said. "The filtration cycle is dropping the temperature." She looked at the coat as if it were a trap. Then she looked at the cleaning drones circling her feet. With a slow, cautious movement, she took the garment and wrapped it around herself. It swallowed her whole, the hem reaching her knees, the sleeves hanging past her fingertips. The smell of his day, oil, dust, and old soap surrounded her. "You look like you're about to collapse," Kaelen said. I've stood for 12 hours, she snapped, though the bite was gone from her voice. I can handle a few more minutes of your company. Follow me, he said, turning toward the residential lifts. There's a canteen near the edge of the sector. You need to eat. She hesitated, looking back at the empty concourse, then at the man who had just bought her freedom with a pocket full of change. She didn't have a choice, but she moved with a shred of dignity, stepping into pace beside him. Just for the food, she whispered. Roger that, Kaelen replied. Just for the food. Vespera felt the weight of the coat more than the weight of the bond. The fabric was thick, a dense weave designed to protect against the abrasive dust of the lower docks, and it carried a heat that felt alien against her skin. For 3 days, she had been a number in a holding cell, a piece of biological inventory waiting for the ledger to balance. The cold had been her only constant companion. Now as she walked beside the man named Kaelen Voss, the warmth of the coat felt like a slow, creeping intrusion. She watched him from the corner of her eye. He didn't walk like a broker or a clerk. He walked with a heavy, rhythmic grace, his shoulders square, and his eyes constantly scanning the environment. He was a predator who had decided to stop hunting, a soldier who had traded his rifle for a sensor wand. She didn't trust him. In the Sapphire District, where her family had once repaired the delicate cooling systems for the elite, she had learned that every transaction had a hidden cost. Men like him didn't buy Bio-Lumes for 5 Scrip out of the goodness of their hearts. They bought them because they wanted something the ledger couldn't name. The canteen was a cavernous space carved into the outer hull of the asteroid. One entire wall was a reinforced transparency, revealing the vast, glittering expanse of the nebula outside. A swirling cloud of violet and gold gas that mocked the gray misery of the crucible. The air here was thicker, smelling of charred meat and fermented grains. Kaelen led her to a corner table, far from the center of the room, where a group of off-duty miners were shouting over a game of credit toss. He gestured for her to sit, then disappeared toward the serving counter. Vespera sat on the edge of the metal chair, her fingers clutching the lapels of the coat. She looked down at her wrists. The blue light of her circuitry was dimming, a sign of low nutrient levels. She was a Bio-Lume, a hybrid of human DNA and bioluminescent synth cells. Her ancestors had been designed to serve as living displays in the era before holographic interfaces became cheap. Now they were relics, used for niche data storage because their organic memory banks were harder to hack than silicon. Kaelen returned with 2 steaming bowls of thick brown broth and a plate of toasted siren bread. He set a cup of sweetened black coffee in front of her. Eat, he said. It's real protein, not the recycled sludge from the pens. Vespera didn't wait. The smell of the salt and fat hit her senses like an explosion. She picked up a piece of bread and dipped it into the broth, her movements fast and desperate before she could stop herself. The first bite was overwhelming. She had to close her eyes as the warmth spread through her chest, a physical sensation of relief that made her throat tighten. Slow down, Kaelen said softly. There's plenty more. She looked up at him, a smear of broth on her lip. Why are you doing this? She asked, her voice hushed. I saw your balance on the terminal. 5 Scrip isn't much to the Union, but it was a chunk of what you had. You don't know me. You don't even know if my databanks are corrupted. I don't care about your databanks, Kaelen said, taking a sip of his own coffee. I told you, I saw a line I didn't want to see crossed. That's all. That's not an answer, she challenged, leaning forward. People in the Crucible don't act on lines. They act on quotas. They act on debt relief. You're an inspector. You're part of the machine that put that slate around my neck. I'm a man who's tired of watching the machine grind people into dust, he replied, his eyes meeting hers with a flat, honest intensity. I spent a long time being the one who turned the handle. I'm done with it. She studied him. There was a weariness in his face that she recognized. It was the same look her father had worn when the Sapphire business collapsed. A quiet, hollowed-out expression that came from realizing the world didn't care about your struggle. And now, she asked, you take me to your unit, and then what? Do I become the one who cleans your floors? The one who fulfills the spouse clause of the contract? Kaelen's expression didn't change, but his voice dropped an octave. You stay in the spare room. You eat. You sleep. Tomorrow I start the paperwork to move you into a voluntary residency status. It's a loophole in the Sector 9 charter. If a bondholder provides a guarantee of maintenance, the debt can be deferred indefinitely. Vespera felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. It was a dangerous, jagged thing, and she tried to crush it immediately. "You're going to lie to the ledger for me?" "I'm going to use the rules against themselves," he said. "They love their forms. I'll just give them a very complicated one." They finished the meal in silence. The miners in the center of the room grew louder, their laughter echoing off the low ceiling. Vespera felt a sudden wave of exhaustion wash over her. The warmth of the food and the coat was making her head heavy. "Let's go," Kaelen said, standing up. "My unit is 3 levels up. It's not a palace, but the air is clean." They walked back to the residential towers, a stack of modular containers welded together in a vertical maze. The lift was cramped, the smell of recycled grease and ozone filling the small space. Vespera stood as far from Kaelen as she could, her back against the metal wall. She watched the floor numbers flicker on his wristcom. When they reached his door, he tapped a code into the keypad. The lock hissed open. The apartment was small, but it was the cleanest place Vespera had seen since the fall. A narrow living area with a worn couch, a kitchenette with a single induction plate, and a hallway leading to 2 doors. The air was indeed clean, filtered through a high-end unit that hummed quietly in the corner. "Bathroom is there," Kaelen said, pointing to the first door. "There's hot water. Use as much as you need. The room at the end is yours. It has a lock. From the inside." He walked to the dresser near the door and picked up a small silver key. He held it out to her. "You keep this," he said. "I don't go in unless you invite me." "Roger that?" Vespera took the key, her fingers brushing his palm. Her skin pulsed with a faint, rhythmic glow at the contact. She looked at the key, then at the room. "I don't understand you," she whispered. "You don't have to," he replied. "Not tonight. Just get some sleep, Vespera." She walked toward the bedroom but stopped at the threshold. She turned back to look at him. He was already taking off his boots, his movements slow and methodical. "Kaelen," she called out. He looked up. "Thank you." "For the bread." He offered a small, almost imperceptible nod. "See you in the morning." Vespera entered the room and closed the door. She heard the click of the lock as she turned the key. She leaned her back against the wood, sliding down until she was sitting on the floor. She looked around the small space, a bed with a real mattress, a window that looked out over the industrial vents. She reached up and touched the glowing pattern on her collarbone. For the first time in her life, the light didn't feel like a brand. It felt like a heartbeat. She took off the heavy coat and folded it carefully, placing it on the chair. She realized she was shaking again, but not from the cold. She was shaking because for the first time in years, she didn't know what was going to happen tomorrow. And for some reason, that didn't feel like a debt. It felt like a beginning. In the living room, Kaelen Voss sat on the worn couch, staring at the closed door. He rubbed his wrist, where the bond symbol sat under his skin. He had 5 Scrip left in his account, a target on his back, and a Bio-Lume in his spare room. He exhaled a long, ragged breath and closed his eyes. "Mission accomplished," he whispered to the empty room. "Now the real fight starts." The internal clock in Kaelen Voss's mind triggered at exactly 500 hours. There was no alarm, no electronic trill to shatter the stillness of the unit. There was only the sudden, sharp awareness of the iron crucible's heartbeat, the low-frequency hum of the atmospheric scrubbers cycling into their morning rhythm. He lay on the worn synthetic leather of the couch, his limbs stiff from a night spent in a state of semi-vigilance. His years in the Pathfinder regiments had made deep sleep a luxury he could no longer afford, or perhaps one he no longer deserved. He sat up slowly, the joints in his back popping with the dry sound of snapping kindling. The living room was bathed in the dim, amber glow of the emergency lights. Through the half-open shutters of the main window, the distant flickering neon of the industrial sectors painted long, blue-gray stripes across the floor. He looked toward the bedroom door. It was still closed, the silver key he had given Vespera likely still resting on the other side of that thin barrier of privacy. Kaelen rubbed his face, his calloused palms rasping against a night's growth of stubble. He felt the phantom weight of his old pulse rifle against his shoulder, a ghost that visited him every morning before the reality of his life as a resonance inspector took hold. He stood and walked to the kitchenette, his bare feet making no sound on the recycled polymer flooring. The routine was his anchor. He filled the small heating vessel with 2 liters of gray water and set it on the induction plate. As the water began to vibrate toward a boil, he pulled a small, jagged piece of whetstone from a drawer. He sat at the counter and began to sharpen his inspection knife, a tool meant for scraping rust and testing the integrity of hull seals, but maintained with the obsessive precision of a combat blade. Shick, shick, shick. The sound was a meditation. He thought about the ghost link currently etched into his wrist and the woman sleeping behind the door. 5 Scrip. He had essentially purchased a human life for the price of a week's worth of synthetic caffeine. The absurdity of the transaction felt like a stone in his gut. In the military, everything had a clear strategic value. A hill, a bridge, a thermal cell, a soldier. But here, in the cold, bureaucratic heart of the crucible, value was a fluid thing, manipulated by men who had never seen the sky. He heard a soft click. The bedroom door opened a few centimeters. Vespera didn't step out immediately. He saw the faint, emerald-green glow of her hair before he saw her face. She was cautious, a scout checking for an ambush. Kaelen kept his eyes on the induction plate, giving her the space she needed to realize the room was safe. "Is the coffee foobar, or is it just the smell of this sector?" Vespera asked. Her voice was scratchy, the bitterness of the previous night still clinging to the edges of her words. But there was a new, raw exhaustion underneath. Kaelen didn't turn around. "It is Orvan leaf," he said, "strong enough to melt a hull plate if you let it sit too long. Sit down. The broth will be ready in 10 minutes. She stepped into the room. She was still wearing the dark shirt he had given her, the oversized fabric hanging off her shoulders. Without the heavy coat, she looked even more fragile, the bioluminescent patterns on her skin pulsing with a rhythmic, pale light that matched the slow thud of a resting heart. She sat on the far end of the couch, her legs tucked under her, watching him with the wary intensity of a trapped bird. "I didn't think you'd stay up all night," she murmured. "I didn't," Kaelen lied. "I just wake up early." Old habits. She looked at the knife in his hand, then at the silver key resting on the low table where she had placed it. "You're a strange one, Voss. Most of the dusters in this sector would have spent the night trying to find the access ports on my skin to see what data they could skim. You just sat here and sharpened a piece of metal." Kaelen finally looked at her. He set the knife down. "I'm not a duster, and I'm not interested in your data. I'm interested in making sure you don't end up back in that liquidation hour." Vespera's pupils narrowed into thin, teal slits. "And why is that? Why do you care if the ledger claims me? We're all just numbers in this scrap heap. You, me, the cook at the canteen. We're all just floating in the red." "Because I'm tired of seeing the red," Kaelen said, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register that made her flinch. "I spent 20 years following orders that turned people into statistics. I'm not doing it on my own time." He poured the hot water into 2 metal mugs, the steam rising in thick, fragrant clouds. He walked over and set one on the table near her, making sure to keep a respectful distance of 2 meters. She reached for it slowly, her fingers trembling as they wrapped around the warmth of the metal. "What's the sit rep for today?" she asked, using a piece of military slang she had likely picked up from the streets. "You going to hide me under the floorboards while you go check your manifest tags?" Kaelen sat back in his chair. "No, I'm taking you with me to the central registry. We're going to file a maintenance guarantee. If we don't get your status changed to voluntary residency by 1800 hours, the ledger will flag you as an abandoned asset. The security wardens will be at my door before midnight." Vespera took a sip of the tea, her eyes widening at the strength of it. "You're crazy. If you take me into the registry, they'll see the ghost link. They'll see I'm a high-value loom. They won't just let you keep me for 5 Scrip. They'll find a reason to reassess the debt." "They can try," Kaelen said, "but I know the charter better than the clerks do. There's a clause in the Colonial Expansion Act, Section 42, subparagraph 9. It allows a registered citizen to claim an indentured spouse if they can prove a steady income and no prior criminal liens. My record is clean, and my manifest numbers are the best in the sector. They won't want to mess with their most efficient inspector over a 5 Scrip bond." She looked at him with a mix of disbelief and something that looked like the first tiny sprout of trust. "You've been planning this since you saw the slate." "I've been thinking about it," he corrected. "Planning is for when you have all the variables. In the crucible, you just react to the resonance." He stood and walked to a small locker near the door. He pulled out a pair of sturdy, leather-soled boots and a set of gray trousers that looked like they belonged to a smaller man. Remnants of a life he didn't talk about. He tossed them onto the couch beside her. "Put those on. The floors at the registry are cold, and I don't want you walking through the docks in those socks. We move out in 30 minutes. Vespera picked up the boots, her fingers tracing the worn leather. "They're old," she said softly. "They work," he replied. "That's all that matters." As she retreated into the bedroom to change, Kaelen turned back to the window. The sun was beginning to hit the upper spires of the iron crucible, though the light would never reach this far down. He could see the silhouettes of the massive transport ships docking at the Tier 9 gates, their engines glowing like angry coals in the dark. He felt the ghost link on his wrist itch. It wasn't just a mark, it was a connection. He could feel a strange, low-frequency vibration emanating from Vespera, a signature of the bioluminescence that was part of her very soul. It was a resonance he didn't know how to inspect. He checked his wristcom. It was 5:45. The walk to the registry would take 20 minutes if the lifts were working. If not, they'd have to take the service ladders, and he wasn't sure she was strong enough for the climb. Vespera stepped out of the room a few minutes later. The trousers were cinched tight with a cord, and the boots looked heavy on her feet. But she stood with a new kind of defiance. She had pulled her hair back into a tight braid, the emerald strands glowing with a subdued intensity. "I'm ready, Voss," she said. "Let's go fight the paper pushers." Kaelen grabbed his bag and his heavy inspector coat. He opened the door and checked the hallway. It was empty, the air smelling of ozone and stale cooking oil. He gestured for her to follow. "Stay close," he said, "and keep your head down. If anyone asks, you're my apprentice." Vespera followed him into the corridor, her heart hammering against her ribs. As the door clicked shut behind them, she realized she hadn't asked him what would happen if the plan failed. She didn't have to. In the iron crucible, failure meant the holding pens, and both of them knew that was a debt no one could pay. They reached the Tier 9 lift station 10 minutes later. The area was crowded with laborers, their faces gray with fatigue, their clothes stained with the various fluids of a station that was slowly falling apart. Kaelen moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his bulk acting as a shield for Vespera. He kept one hand on his bag and his other eye on the crowd, his Pathfinder training never truly leaving him. "Hey, Voss!" a voice called out from the side. Kaelen stiffened but didn't stop. A man in a grease-stained jumpsuit stepped into their path. It was Jax, a low-level scavenger who spent his days picking through the scrap heaps of the lower docks. He had a wandering eye and a habit of knowing things he shouldn't. "Early start, isn't it?" Jax said, his gaze sliding toward Vespera. "And who's the new spark?" "Didn't know you were taking on help." "She's a manifest apprentice," Kaelen said, his voice flat. "Move aside, Jax. We're on a clock." "Apprentice, huh?" Jax smirked, his yellowed teeth catching the light. "She's got a lot of glow for an apprentice. Looks like a Bio-Lume. High-tier hardware. You find her in a crate, or did you finally spend some of those scripts you've been hoarding?" "Get out of the way," Kaelen said, his hand moving toward the resonance wand at his belt. Jax held up his hands, stepping back with a mocking bow. "Easy, Inspector. Just making conversation. Hard to find anything that bright in this sector. Just make sure she doesn't short out." "The Ledger hates a faulty asset." Kaelen pushed past him, his jaw set in a hard line. He felt Vespera's hand brush against the back of his coat, a tentative touch that suggested she was closer to him than she was to the world around her. "Ignore him," Kaelen muttered as they stepped into the lift. "He's just a bottom feeder looking for a scrap." "He's right, though," Vespera said, her voice barely audible over the grind of the lift's gears. "I am bright. I don't belong here." "You belong wherever you choose to be," Kaelen said, looking straight ahead as the lift began its jerky ascent toward the registry. "That's what we're going to prove today." The lift stopped at the 500th level with a jarring thud. The doors slid open to reveal the lobby of the central registry, a vast clinical space filled with the sound of humming servers and the rhythmic clacking of pneumatic tubes. This was where the life of every soul in the crucible was distilled into data. Here there were no people, only balances. Kaelen led Vespera toward the main terminal bank. He could feel the weight of the ghost link pulsing on his wrist, a beacon in a room designed to detect every anomaly. He took a deep breath, the cold, filtered air stinging his lungs. "Stay behind me," he whispered. "Let me do the talking." Vespera nodded, her eyes wide as she looked at the towering walls of datacasts. She felt like she was walking into the mouth of a god made of glass and cold light, one that didn't know the meaning of mercy. Kaelen approached the counter, where a clerk with skin the color of old parchment was staring into a holographic display. The man didn't look up, his fingers moving across the interface with the mechanical precision of a drone. "Registry 804, the clerk said, his voice a monotonous drone. "State your business and your account ID." "Kaelen Hale, Inspector ID. 6942, Kaelen said, his voice echoing in the sterile lobby. "I'm here to file a maintenance guarantee and a status reassignment for a bonded spouse." The clerk's fingers stopped. He looked up, his eyes shielded by thick, protective lenses. "Bonded spouse? In Sector 9? That's a Tier 3 transaction. You're in the wrong office, Inspector." "Check the charter," Kaelen said, his voice gaining a sudden, commanding edge. "Colonial Expansion Act, Section 42. Any registered citizen in a hazardous duty sector can file for local residency of a bonded asset if the maintenance threshold is met. My income is 3 times the threshold. I'm filing the paperwork here to avoid the Tier 3 surcharge." The clerk squinted, his head tilting like a bird's. "Maintenance threshold," he muttered. "Nobody uses that clause. It's a relic of the terraforming days." "It's still in the code," Kaelen said, "and I'm using it. Now open the manifest for Urani, Vespera, and link it to my ID." The clerk sighed, a sound of profound annoyance, and began to tap at his screen. Vespera stood perfectly still, her heart thumping against her ribs so hard she was sure the clerk could hear it. She looked at Kalen's back, the broad set of his shoulders, the way he stood his ground against the bureaucracy. She realized then that he wasn't just fighting for her status, he was fighting for her name. It was the first time anyone had ever done that. And in that moment, in the cold gray heart of the iron crucible, the 5 Scrip bond began to feel like something else entirely. It felt like a promise. Vespera stood in the shadow of Kaelen Voss, her eyes darting between the flickering holographic displays and the pale, sweating face of the clerk. The air in the central registry was different from the docks. It was thinner, over-filtered until it lacked any trace of the organic world. It was the smell of dead information. The clerk's eyes, behind the thick lenses, were scanning the data stream associated with her ghost link. Vespera felt an old, familiar coldness seep into her bones. This was the moment where she usually became a commodity. In the Sapphire District, she had been a repository for high-level diplomatic codes. In the holding pens, she had been a potential labor unit. Here, she was a series of encrypted blocks that didn't quite fit the inspector's income bracket. "Hold on," the clerk said, his voice losing its bored drone and sharpening with suspicion. "This asset, she's not a standard debt worker. This is a Bio-Lume, sapphire grade. Her base value is 10,000 credits. How did you get a bond on this for 5 Scrip?" Kaelen didn't flinch. He leaned his forearms on the counter, a move that was both casual and dominating. "The liquidation concourse in Sector 9, 19th hour yesterday. It was a fire sale, friend. The broker wanted the ledger closed before the shift change. I saw the price. I had the credits. I made the trade. The transaction is already stamped by the ledger. Check the timestamp if you don't believe me." The clerk's fingers flew across the keyboard. His face paled as the numbers confirmed Kalen's story. "This is highly irregular. A sapphire grade for 5 Scrip? The union is going to have a fit when this hits the audit. The union doesn't audit 5 Scrip transactions in Sector 9, Kaelen said, his voice like grinding stones. They're too busy chasing the million credit leaks in the spires. Now file the maintenance guarantee. I'm not here to discuss the market. I'm here to exercise my rights as a citizen." Vespera watched the clerk. She saw the moment the man's greed warred with his fear of the rules. He looked at her, his gaze lingering on the glowing patterns of her skin, then back at Kaelen's inspector badge. He knew Kaelen was a man who understood the resonance of the station, a man who could make things very difficult if he was pushed. "Fine," the clerk muttered, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm filing the guarantee, but I'm flagging it for secondary review. If the auditors find a discrepancy, the bond is voided and the asset is reclaimed by the state." Kaelen nodded. "I expect nothing less. Give me the confirmation slip." The machine hissed, and a thin piece of metallic paper slid out of a slot. Kaelen grabbed it, folded it once, and tucked it into his pocket. He turned to Vespera and nodded toward the exit. "We're done here," he said. They walked out of the lobby and back toward the lift. Vespera didn't speak until they were safely inside the small, vibrating car. She looked at Kaelen, her teal eyes bright with a mix of awe and terror. "You actually did it," she whispered. "You just told a registry clerk to shove 10,000 credits of debt into a maintenance clause." "I told him the truth," Kaelen said, though his eyes were fixed on the floor indicator. "The system is built on the idea that everything has a fixed price, but the people who run the system are lazy. They'd rather follow a stamp than a soul." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a shadow of a smile touch his lips. It wasn't a smile of joy, but one of grim satisfaction. "We've bought ourselves some time, Vespera, but the flag on the file means we can't stay in the lower sectors forever. Once the audit hits, and it will, they'll come looking for the missing value." "And where will we be?" she asked. Kaelen didn't answer immediately. The lift groaned as it descended back toward the industrial levels. He looked at the mark on his wrist, the interlocking circles that bound them together. "There are sectors where the ledger doesn't reach," he said finally, "places where the resonance is too noisy for the auditors to track. But we need to get you stabilized first. You're leaking light, Vespera. If your nutrient levels drop any lower, your biological memory will start to degrade." She looked down at her hands. The glow was indeed fading, turning from a vibrant emerald to a dull, sickly yellow. She felt the weight of the data she carried, thousands of lines of code she couldn't read, a burden of information that was slowly eating her from the inside out. "I need a recharge," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But the Bio-Lume ports are only in the upper spires. If I go there, they'll scan my ID and the whole thing will blow." "I have a friend," Kaelen said, "a former medic from the frontier regiments. He's a bit rough around the edges, but he knows how to hack a nutrient pump. He's in Sector 12. "Sector 12? Vespera shivered. "That's the smelter. The air is 90% sulfur and the temperature is 50 degrees. It's also the only place where no one asks questions about why a Bio-Lume is getting a black market recharge," Kaelen said. "We'll go tonight. For now, we go back to the unit. You need to rest." As they stepped out of the lift and back into the crowded Tier 9 walkway, Vespera felt a strange sense of displacement. Only 24 hours ago, she had been standing on a tile, waiting for someone to buy her like a piece of scrap. Now she was part of a conspiracy, walking beside a man who was willing to risk everything for a 5 Scrip debt. They reached the apartment without further incident, though Kaelen was even more vigilant than before, his eyes never staying on one spot for more than a second. Once inside, he locked the door and engaged the secondary bolt. He turned to her, his face grim. "Listen to me, Vespera. The next few days are going to be foobar. The registry flag will alert the local wardens. They won't come officially, but they'll send someone to poke around. If anyone knocks, you don't answer. You stay in the bedroom." "Roger that?" "Roger that," she said, mirroring his military tone. Kaelen walked to the kitchenette and began to pull supplies from the cupboards. He seemed driven by a sudden, restless energy. He was no longer just an inspector. He was a man on a mission. "I'm going to the market to get some sulfur filters for our mass," he said. "I won't be long. There's some cured meat in the chiller. Eat it all. You need the salt for the smelter." He grabbed his bag and headed for the door, but paused with his hand on the latch. He looked back at her, his expression unreadable. "Vespera, do you trust me?" She looked at him, her teal eyes searching his. She thought about the 5 Scrip. She thought about the silver key. She thought about the way he had stood up to the clerk. "I don't trust the world, Voss," she said softly, "but I think I trust the man who sharpens knives in the dark." Kaelen nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement. "Good. Keep the door locked." He stepped out, and the sound of the deadbolts engaging echoed in the quiet room. Vespera stood in the center of the living area, the oversized shirt still hanging from her frame. She felt the silence of the apartment press in on her, but for the first time, it wasn't the silence of a cell. It was the silence of a fortress. She walked to the window and pushed the shutters open a few more centimeters. Below, the iron crucible churned with its eternal, mechanical life. She could see the thousands of lights, each representing a soul bound by debt, a life reduced to a line in the ledger. She looked at her own reflection in the darkened glass. The emerald glow of her hair was dim, but her eyes were steady. She wasn't just a Bio-Lume anymore. She wasn't just a 5 Scrip wife. She was something else, something the ledger didn't have a code for. She walked to the bedroom and lay down on the bed, the mattress yielding beneath her. She closed her eyes and listened to the hum of the station. Somewhere in the distance, a massive cargo ship was departing, its engines vibrating through the rock of the asteroid. She fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the silver key tucked under her pillow. 3 hours later, a sharp, rhythmic rapping at the front door woke her. Vespera sat up, her heart jumping into her throat. It wasn't Kaelen's knock. Kaelen had a key, and he always announced himself with a specific, low-frequency whistle. This knock was heavy, official, and impatient. "Inspector Voss?" A voice called out from the hallway. "This is Warden Miller, Sector 9 Security. We have a discrepancy in your morning filing." "Open up." Vespera held her breath, her body frozen. She remembered Kaelen's words. "If anyone knocks, you don't answer." The knock came again, harder this time. The door groaned on its hinges. "Voss, we know you're in there. Your risk-com is pinging the local net. Don't make us override the lock. It'll just add to your fines." Vespera looked at the door, then at the window. She was on the 5th level. There was no escape that way. She felt the panic rising, a cold wave that threatened to short out her bioluminescence. Her skin began to pulse with a rapid, frantic light, painting the room in jagged strobes of emerald and violet. "Stop it," she hissed to herself, clutching her arms. "Stop glowing." She retreated to the corner of the bedroom, behind the dresser. She reached under the pillow and gripped the silver key, her only weapon, her only connection to the man who had promised to protect her. The sound of an electronic bypass hummed at the door. The deadbolts clicked open one by one. The front door swung wide, and 2 men in the light, gray armor of the security wardens stepped into the living room. They carried shock staves, their visors glowing with a cold, blue light as they scanned the apartment. "Clear," one of them said, his voice distorted by his helmet. The other one walked toward the kitchenette, his boots loud on the floor. "Where's the asset?" "The ledger says she was registered here 6 hours ago. Check the bedroom," the first one ordered. Vespera pressed her back against the wall, her breath coming in shallow, silent gasps. She watched the bedroom door. The shadow of the warden appeared in the gap, growing larger as he approached. She felt a sudden, sharp resonance in the air, a vibration so low it was felt rather than heard. Suddenly, the front door slammed shut. "What the?" A muffled grunt followed, then the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. The warden at the bedroom door turned around, his shock staff crackling. "Miller! Report!" There was no answer, only the sound of the atmospheric scrubber suddenly roaring to life, the vents in the ceiling exhaling a thick white mist that filled the living room in seconds. Vespera heard the sound of a struggle, the rhythmic thud of fists against armor, the sizzle of a shock staff hitting a wall unit. It was fast, efficient, and brutal. A minute later, the mist began to clear. Vespera stayed hidden, her heart racing. She heard a familiar, low-frequency whistle. "Vespera? It's me. It's clear." She stood up, her legs shaking so hard she had to lean on the dresser for support. She walked into the living room. Kaelen was standing in the center of the apartment, his face streaked with sweat and soot. His inspector coat was torn at the shoulder. At his feet, the 2 wardens lay unconscious, their armor dented, their shock staves shattered. "Kaelen," she whispered. "We have to go," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "Now." "I didn't think they'd move this fast. Jax must have sold us out the moment we left the registry." "What about them?" she asked, gesturing to the wardens. "They'll be out for an hour," Kaelen said, grabbing his bag from the counter. "By then, we'll be in the smelter. Put your mask on. The service tunnels are flooded with coolant gas." He handed her a heavy industrial respirator. Vespera took it, her fingers brushing his. She saw the blood on his knuckles. "You fought the wardens," she said, her voice filled with a new kind of realization. "You're an inspector, Voss. You just committed a capital crime." He looked at her, his eyes hard and determined. "I'm a pathfinder, Vespera, and I'm finishing the mission." He grabbed her hand, his grip firm and warm. He didn't lead her as an owner leads a slave. He led her as a partner leads a comrade through a minefield. "Let's move," he said. "Time to bug out." They stepped out into the hallway, leaving the apartment and the life Kaelen had built behind. As they vanished into the dark, echoing service tunnels of the Iron Crucible, Vespera realized that the 5 Scrip bond was no longer a weight around her neck. It was the fuel for a fire that was just beginning to burn. The Crucible was cycling, but for the first time, Vespera and Kaelen were no longer part of the cycle. They were the anomaly. They were the ghost in the machine, and they were finally moving toward the light. The service tunnels between Sector 9 and Sector 12 were never intended for human passage. They were the veins of the Iron Crucible, designed for the transit of superheated coolant, high-pressure steam, and the jagged waste of the smelting pits. The air here was a thick, yellow soup of sulfur and particulate metal that tasted of scorched earth and ancient lightning. Kaelen Voss led the way, his industrial respirator hissing with every labored breath. He moved with a heavy, predatory focus, his resonance wand held low like a sidearm. Behind him, Vespera stumbled, her boots, too large and stiff for her feet, clattering against the rusted grating of the catwalk. The emerald glow of her hair was now a flickering, sickly amber, casting long, shivering shadows against the weeping pipes. "Move," Kaelen grunted through the comlink in his mask. His voice was a metallic rasp, distorted by the filtration units. "We have 3 kilometers of vertical descent before we hit the smelter gates. Stay on the center rail. The edges are corroded to hell." "I'm trying, boss." Vespera's voice was a jagged whisper in his ear, punctuated by the ragged sounds of her own respirator. "Everything's spinning. My circuits. They're redlining." Kaelen stopped and turned. He caught her by the shoulders just as her knees buckled. Her skin felt hot through the oversized shirt, a feverish electric heat. The bioluminescent patterns on her throat were pulsing out of sync, a chaotic staccato that signaled a total biological collapse. "Eyes on me, Vespera," Kaelen commanded, his grip tightening. "Stay frosty. We're almost through the vent stacks. If you fade out here, the scrubbers will chew you up before I can get a lock on your signal." "I'm not a signal," she wheezed, her teal eyes searching his visor. "I'm a person. You said, I'm a person." "Then act like one and keep your feet moving," he snapped, but he didn't let go of her arm. He tucked her shoulder under his, taking half her weight. They moved like a single, wounded animal through the steam. Kaelen's internal compass, calibrated over years of Pathfinder operations, tracked their progress through the darkness. They were descending into the iron lungs, the deepest part of the asteroid, where the station's massive core drills met the smelting furnaces. It was a place where the law of the ledger was replaced by the law of physics. If you couldn't stand the heat, you were recycled. As they neared the junction to Sector 12, the temperature spiked. The walls began to vibrate with a low-frequency thrum that made Kaelen's teeth ache. This was the smelter's resonance, the sound of 10,000 tons of ore being crushed and melted every hour. Kaelen checked his wristcom. It had been 45 minutes since they had left the apartment. The wardens would have called for backup by now. A secondary review on a Bio-Lume didn't just mean an audit, it meant a retrieval team. In the eyes of the Synaptic Union, Vespera wasn't a wife or a citizen. She was a hard drive with a heartbeat, and they didn't like their data walking off with a disgruntled inspector. "Why?" Vespera asked suddenly, her voice sounding delirious. "Why blow your life for a 5 Scrip glitch? You were 5 by 5, Voss. You had a job, you had a bed. Now you're a ghost." Kaelen didn't answer for a long time. He adjusted the strap of his bag, the weight of the sulfur filters pressing against his spine. "Because I saw a village burn once," he said finally, his voice flat, "on a moon called Velonis Prime. 300 families written off as collateral because the ore yield was 10% below quota. I was the one who pulled the trigger on the atmospheric incinerators. The silence that followed was filled only by the roar of the steam pipes. I decided then that I wouldn't let the numbers win again, Kaelen continued. Buying you wasn't about redemption. It was about refusing to be a part of the arithmetic. You're a terrible accountant, Voss, Vespera whispered, her head lolling against his shoulder. I'm an inspector, he replied. I know when a structure is about to collapse. The crucible is a lie, Vespera. It's a tomb with a neon sign. They reached a massive circular hatch marked with the scorched insignia of Sector 12. Kaelen punched a code into the keypad, an old override he'd retained from his days in the reserves. The gears groaned, protesting the heat, and the hatch slid open with a screech of metal on metal. The smelter hit them like a physical blow. It was a cavernous, subterranean void, illuminated by the blinding, white-orange rivers of molten iron flowing through open channels below. The air was a shimmering haze of heat mirages. Thousands of workers, reduced to silhouettes in their protective hardsuits, moved like ants along the glowing veins of the station. There were no lights here, only the fire of the forge. Kaelen led her toward a cluster of derelict shipping containers welded into the side of a massive cooling tower. This was the low-yield zone, a slum for those whose debt was so high they were no longer allowed to breathe the filtered air of the upper tiers. He stopped in front of a container marked with a faded red cross in a series of jagged, hand-painted runes. He hammered a rhythmic code against the steel door. Go away, a voice boomed from inside, muffled by a vocoder. The clinic is closed. Come back when you're dead. Eris, it's Voss, Kaelen shouted over the roar of a nearby furnace. I've got a high-priority manifest. It's a code 0. The door hissed open a crack. A man with a face like a topographical map of a war zone peered out. He wore a heavy lead-lined apron over a tattered surgical gown, and a pair of magnifying goggles sat atop his bald head. This was Eris Thorne, a man who had been a head medic in the frontier regiments before a disagreement with a colonel had landed him in the smelter. Voss? Eris growled, his gaze sliding down to the trembling woman slumped against Kaelen's side. What the hell have you brought to my door? She's a Bio-Lume, Eris. She's dimming. I need a nutrient recharge and a biometric wipe. Eris let out a low whistle, his eyes widening as he took in the flickering emerald patterns on Vespera's skin. A sapphire grade? Are you out of your mind, Kaelen? You don't bring a 10,000 Scrip asset into the smelter. That's like bringing a flare into a dark room. Every scavenger within 10 kilometers is going to see that glow. She's not an asset, Kaelen said, his voice dropping into that dangerous quiet tone. She's my wife, by the ledger. Eris froze, his goggles slipping down onto his nose. You're... What? You actually signed the bond? Kaelen pushed past him, carrying Vespera into the cramped, sweltering interior of the clinic. The space was filled with the hum of jury-rigged medical equipment and the smell of antiseptic and burnt sugar. He laid her down on a rusted surgical table, her head lolling back as the respirator fell away. Her skin was now almost translucent, the bioluminescence reduced to a faint, ghostly pulse in her veins. Eris slammed the door and engaged the magnetic locks. You've lost it, Voss. Completely fewbar. Do you have any idea what the synaptic union does to people who liberate sapphire hardware? They won't just liquidate your account. They'll use your neural tissue for processing power. Just fix her, Eris, Kaelen said, his hands shaking as he pulled a small pouch of Scrip from his bag. I have 40 credits left. Take them. Just give her the recharge. Eris looked at the money, then at the dying woman, and finally at his old comrade. He sighed, a heavy, defeated sound. Keep your Scrip, you idiot. You're going to need them for the bribe at the shuttle docks. He moved with sudden, practiced efficiency, snapping on a pair of latex gloves and pulling a heavy, black-market nutrient pump from a locker. He began to prime the tubes, the thick, blue fluid shimmering with synthetic enzymes. Vespera opened her eyes, her gaze drifting toward Eris, then to the ceiling. Is this the end of the line? She whispered. Not today, Sparky, Eris said, his voice softening just a fraction. This is going to feel like someone's pouring liquid ice into your marrow. Try not to scream. It attracts the neighbors. He found the access port at the base of her skull, a small, crystalline socket hidden beneath her hair. He slid the needle in with a sickening click. Vespera's body arched off the table. Her eyes rolled back, and the bioluminescence in her skin flared into a blinding, violent white. She didn't scream, but the sound of her breath catching in her throat was worse. Kaelen stepped forward, taking her hand. Her fingers crushed his, her grip fueled by the sheer agony of the nutrient surge. "Stay with me, Vespera," he murmured. "Hold the line." As the blue fluid began to pump into her system, the chaotic patterns on her skin started to stabilize. The emerald light returned, deeper and more vibrant than before. But as Eris monitored the data feed on his terminal, his brow furrowed. "That's strange," the medic muttered, tapping at a flickering screen. "What?" Kaelen asked, his eyes never leaving Vespera's face. "Her memory banks," Eris said, his voice tight. "They're not just holding debt records or diplomatic codes. There's a ghost in here, Kaelen. A massive, encrypted file structure buried in the non-volatile DNA. Can you read it?" Eris shook his head. "No. It's a triple-blind encryption. But whatever it is, it's drawing a lot of power. This isn't just data, Voss. This is a map. Or a key. A key to what?" Eris looked at him, his face pale in the emerald light. "I don't know. But I do know one thing. The secondary review at the registry, it wasn't about the money. They know what she's carrying, and they aren't going to stop until they cut it out of her." Kaelen looked down at Vespera. She was breathing easier now, the color returning to her face. She looked back at him, a faint, tired smile touching her lips. "You saved me again," she whispered. "I'm just doing my job," he said, but the lie felt heavy in his mouth. Outside, the roar of the furnaces was interrupted by a new sound. The rhythmic, mechanical thud of heavy boots on the steel catwalk. Not workers, wardens, and they weren't knocking. Kaelen looked at Eris. "How many exits?" "One," the medic said, reaching under the table and pulling out a battered pulse pistol. "And it's about to get very crowded." Kaelen squeezed Vespera's hand one last time, then stood, drawing his resonance wand and a heavy, serrated combat knife. The time for paperwork was over. The resonance of the smelter was changing, shifting into the frequency of war. "We're not numbers," he whispered to the closed door. "We're the glitch." And in the darkness of the smelter, the glitch was finally ready to fight back. The magnetic lock on the container door groaned under the weight of a breaching charge. The boom was muffled by the roar of the smelting pits, but the vibration traveled through the floor and up Kaelen's shins. Inside Eris's clinic, the air was suddenly charged with the static scent of ozone and impending violence. Eris Thorne was already moving. The medic wasn't just a butcher of bodies. He was a survivor of the frontier wars. He kicked over a heavy metal cabinet, spilling hundreds of glass vials across the floor, and used the steel frame as a makeshift barricade. "Get her off the table!" Eris hissed, his pulse pistol humming as it cycled to full power. "The pump is at 90%. It'll have to be enough." Kaelen didn't hesitate. He reached for the crystalline needle at the base of Vespera's neck. He felt the cold blue vibration of the nutrient fluid still humming through the tube. "Vespera, I'm pulling the line." "Brace yourself," he warned. She didn't nod. She simply gripped the edges of the rusted table until her knuckles turned white. Kaelen yanked the needle out. Vespera gasped, a sharp, ragged sound, and collapsed forward into his arms. The emerald glow of her skin was now so bright it illuminated the entire container, turning Eris's scarred face into a mask of green light and deep shadows. "I've got you," Kaelen muttered, his voice a low vibration against her ear. "Can you stand?" "I can fly if I have to," she whispered, her voice infused with the artificial adrenaline of the nutrient surge. "My God, Voss, I can feel everything." The door buckled inward. A second charge blew the hinges, and the steel slab fell with a thunderous clang. Two figures in full-body tactical hardsuits, marked with the crimson eye of the Synaptic Union, stepped through the smoke. They weren't Sector 9 wardens. These were retrieval specialists, men whose humanity had been stripped away and replaced by combat subroutines. "Contact!" one of the specialists barked, his voice a mechanical rasp through his helmet. "Asset identified. Priority 1. Eliminate the interceptors. Eris fired first. A bolt of blue plasma screamed across the room, catching the lead specialist in the chest plate. The armor absorbed most of the impact, but the force knocked the man back into the catwalk. Kaelen didn't wait for them to recover. He lunged over the barricade, his resonance wand humming at a lethal frequency. He wasn't a soldier anymore, but his body remembered the rhythm of the Pathfinder strikes. He ducked under a return shot, the heat of the pulse bolt singeing his hair, and drove the resonance wand into the second specialist's neck seal. The wand vibrated at the exact frequency of the suit's cooling system. The specialist let out a muffled cry as his hard suit's internal temperature spiked to 500 degrees Celsius in a fraction of a second. He collapsed, steam hissing from his vents. "Voss! More coming!" Eris yelled, firing a volley into the smoke-filled corridor. Kaelen scrambled back to Vespera. She was standing now, her eyes wide, her pupils fully dilated. She looked at the fallen specialists, then at Kaelen. There was no fear in her expression, only a terrifying cold clarity. "They're not here for the debt, Voss," she said, her voice sounding like two stones grinding together. "They're here for the archive." "The archive?" "What archive?" Kaelen asked, grabbing his bag and pulling her toward the back of the container. "The thing in my head," she said, clutching her skull. It's not codes, it's a consciousness. A copy of the Prime Director." Kaelen froze. The Prime Director of the Synaptic Union was a mythical figure, a mind that had been digitized 2 centuries ago to rule the outer colonies through the ledger. If Vespera was carrying a copy of that mind, she wasn't just a Bio-Lume. She was the most dangerous piece of hardware in the galaxy. "Eris, we need a back way out," Kaelen shouted. "The ventilation duct." Eris pointed to a small circular opening behind a stack of oxygen tanks. "It leads to the slag chutes. It's a 40-meter drop into the waste pools, but it's the only way. They won't be waiting for you." "What about you?" Kaelen asked, looking at his old friend. Eris grinned, showing his yellow teeth. "I'm a medic, Kaelen. I'll tell them you took me hostage. They need me to patch up their specialists. Now bug out!" Kaelen grabbed Vespera and hoisted her toward the duct. "Go! Crawl until you hit the incline, then slide. Don't stop for anything." Vespera scrambled into the dark metal tube. Kaelen followed, his broad shoulders barely fitting through the opening. He looked back one last time at Eris, who was already reloading his pistol, his face set in a grim mask of defiance. "Thanks, Eris," Kaelen said. "Get out of here, Voss," Eris replied. "And for the love of the stars, don't let them turn her back into a number." Kaelen pulled the vent cover shut behind him and plunged into the darkness. The descent was a nightmare of heat and noise. The slag chutes were designed to carry the cooling crust of molten iron away from the main pits. The metal under Kaelen's hands was blistering hot, even through his gloves. He could hear Vespera sliding ahead of him, her light reflecting off the soot-covered walls. "Vespera! Talk to me!" he shouted, his voice echoing in the confined space. I'm okay," she cried out, her voice punctuated by the clatter of her boots. "The archive. It's trying to talk to me, Kaelen. It's telling me how to shut down the ledger." "Don't listen to it," Kaelen commanded. "It's a ghost, Vespera. It'll hollow you out." Suddenly, the chute opened up. Kaelen felt the sensation of weightlessness for a terrifying second before he slammed into a pool of thick, viscous coolant sludge. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs, and he struggled to the surface, his eyes stinging from the chemical fumes. He saw Vespera a few meters away, her emerald glow illuminating the dark, cavernous waste pool. She was standing in the knee-deep sludge, her head tilted back, her skin pulsing with a rhythmic golden light. Vespera. Kaelen waded toward her, his legs heavy in the thick fluid. She turned to him, but her eyes weren't pale teal anymore. They were a brilliant, burning gold. "It's so beautiful, Kaelen," she whispered, her voice echoing with 1,000 different timbres. The resonance of the station. "It's just a song, and I know the lyrics." "Vespera, look at me." Kaelen grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her. "This isn't you. You're not the archive. You're Vespera. You're a person." She blinked, the gold in her eyes receding like a tide. She gasped, her body suddenly going limp in his arms. The emerald light returned, but it was dim, flickering like a dying candle. "Kaelen, I'm scared," she whimpered, clutching his coat. It's so big. It's too big for me. I know, he said, pulling her close. I know. But we're going to get it out. Or we're going to bury it so deep they'll never find it. They scrambled out of the waste pool and onto a narrow, rusted ledge that overlooked the lower smelting pits. They were in the dead zone, a part of the station where the gravity was unstable and the air was too thin for long-term survival. Kaelen checked his wristcom. His locator was dead. The coolant had fried the electronics. They were off the grid. But as he looked up, he saw a flickering holographic sign hanging from a nearby gantry. Shuttle Bay 6, 3 kilometers. That's our exit, he said, pointing toward the sign. If we can get a pilot to take us to the outer rim, we can disappear. With what? Vespera asked, her voice trembling. We have no money, Voss. We're fugitives. No one takes a fugitive for free. I have something they want, Kaelen said, his hand moving to his inner pocket. He pulled out his Pathfinder medal, a small platinum star given to him after the Velones campaign. It was the only thing he had left of his old life. It was worth at least 500 scrip on the black market. You'd sell that? Vespera asked. For me? Kaelen looked at the medal, then at the woman whose life he had bought for 5 scrip. He realized then that the numbers had finally stopped adding up. The math was gone. There was only the resonance of the moment. It's just a piece of metal, Vespera, he said. You're the only thing here that's real. He took her hand, and they began to walk along the narrow ledge, high above the rivers of fire. The turning point had come and gone. Kaelen Voss was no longer an inspector, and Vespera was no longer a debt bond. They were two souls moving through the dark, defined not by what they owed, but by what they were willing to give. But behind them in the shadows of the smelter, a new sound began to rise. A high-pitched electronic whine, a tracking drone. The synaptic union wasn't finished with their arithmetic, and in the iron crucible, every debt was eventually collected. Kaelen tightened his grip on Vespera's hand. Don't look back, he said. Just keep moving toward the light. In the distance, the shuttle bay beckoned, a single star in a universe of iron and fire. They had 3 kilometers to go, and the whole station was waking up to hunt them. Trust me, Kaelen thought, his heart thudding against his ribs. Just trust me. The dead zone of the iron crucible was a cathedral of discarded intentions. Here in the hollowed-out spaces where the gravity generators flickered like dying candles, the air was a thin, frigid mist that tasted of ancient vacuum and frozen hydraulic fluid. Kaelen Voss moved with the muscle memory of a man who had spent half his life in the dark, his hand never leaving the grip of his resonance wand. Every 30 seconds, he would pause, tilting his head to catch the specific frequency of the tracking drones. The sound was a high-pitched electronic whine, a digital mosquito that smelled of ozone and relentless logic. It was the sound of the synaptic union closing a loop. Stay behind me, Kaelen whispered, his voice a low vibration in the silence. We're moving into the ventilation conduits of the old core. The plating is 3 centuries old, but it's dense enough to scatter their thermal sensors. Vespera followed, her emerald hair now a jagged crown of flickering light. She looked like a celestial body caught in a jar, her skin pulsing with a rhythmic golden undertone that hadn't been there 2 hours ago. Every few steps, she would stumble, her hands going to her temples as if trying to keep her skull from splitting open. Voss, she said, her voice sounding like it was being processed through a failing vocoder. The archive, it's not just talking anymore. It's mapping. It's showing me every soul on this station. I can see their debts. I can see their heartbeats. It's like a sea of red ink, and I'm drowning in it. Don't look at the data, Kaelen said, his voice sharp with command. Look at my back. Focus on the physical, the cold, the smell of the sulfur. That's what's real. Everything else is just math. It's not just math, she cried out, her voice echoing in the rusted pipe. It's their lives, Kaelen. I can see a mother in Sector 4 who's 3 credits away from liquidation. I can see a boy in the mines whose oxygen tax just doubled. If I let the archive in, I can delete them. I can wipe the ledger clean. I can set everyone free. Kaelen stopped and turned, his face illuminated by her golden glow. And what happens to Vespera when the archive finishes the job? You think that ghost cares about you? It wants a host, not a person. It'll use your neurons to rewrite the code, and when the light fades, there won't be anyone left to remember why you did it. A high-pitched beep cut through the air. A tracking drone dropped from a maintenance hatch 20 meters above them, its red eye swiveling with mechanical precision. Target acquired, the drone's speaker crackled. Initiation of retrieval protocol. Kaelen didn't think. He reacted. He lunged forward, the resonance wand humming as he drove it into the drone's sensor array. The machine screeched, sparks flying as the frequency of the wand vibrated its internal circuits into a molten slurry. But as it fell, a second drone, then a third, drifted into the conduit. Foo bar, Kaelen hissed. We're hard targets now. Run! They scrambled through the narrow pipe, the clatter of their boots a frantic rhythm against the metal. The air grew thinner, the cold biting through their clothes as they climbed higher into the station's skeletal structure. Kaelen's breath was a white cloud in front of his face, his lungs burning with the effort of the ascent. They reached a junction where the conduit opened into a vast dark chamber, the secondary oxygen reclamation vault. It was a forest of massive, dormant fans, their blades as long as shuttle wings, hanging in the shadows like prehistoric bones. In the center of the vault stood a man. He was dressed in a dark, tailored suit that looked entirely out of place in the industrial filth of the dead zone. Beside him stood two retrieval specialists, their shock staves glowing with a menacing blue light. The man's face was smooth, almost plastic, with eyes that reflected no light. Inspector Voss, the man said, his voice a silk-wrapped blade. I am Director Vane. You've caused quite a disturbance in the arithmetic. Kaelen stepped in front of Vespera, his hand on his knife. I'm just an inspector, Vane. I'm here to file a grievance about the lack of maintenance in the dead zone. Vane smiled, a movement of the lips that didn't reach his eyes. Humor, a common defense mechanism for those whose value is nearing zero. But we both know why you're here. You've stolen a piece of hardware that doesn't belong in the hands of a man who lives on 40 scrip a month. She's a citizen, Kaelen said, his voice like iron. Her name is Vespera. Vespera is a series of organic memory cells currently hosting a strategic asset, Vane replied, his gaze sliding toward the woman. She is the container. You, Voss, are merely the thief who broke the lock. But I'm a man of business. Give us the archive, and I'll restore your account. I'll give you a clean record, a pension, and a shuttle pass to the inner rim. You can live the rest of your life in a garden instead of a tomb. Kaelen felt Vespera's hand on his shoulder. Her skin was burning, the golden light now so intense it was painful to look at. She was looking at Vane, her pupils wide and shimmering. Voss, she whispered. He's right. I can feel the archive. It wants to go back. It wants the network. If I give it to him, it stops hurting. Don't you dare, Kaelen said, looking back at her. Don't you dare become a line on his ledger. Vane tilted his head. Why do you protect her, Kaelen? Is it for the woman or for the sin? We know about Velonis Prime. We know about the 300 families you liquidated. You think saving one Bio-Lume makes the numbers go back to zero? You think you can buy your way out of hell with 5 scrip? Kaelen flinched as if he had been struck. The memory of the atmospheric incinerators, the roar of the fire on that distant moon, flooded his mind. He saw the faces of the children he hadn't saved, the numbers he had helped to erase. The specialists stepped forward, their shock staves crackling. He's a murderer, Vespera, Vane said, his voice a hypnotic drone. He didn't save you because he loves you. He saved you because he's a coward who can't live with the man he was. He's using you as a shield against his own ghosts. Vespera looked at Kaelen, her teal eyes searching his face. The golden light flickered. Is it true, she asked, her voice trembling. Did you kill all those people? Yes, Kaelen whispered, his heart thudding like a dying engine. I followed the orders. I did the math. I turned 300 lives into a zero. The silence in the vault was absolute. Vane smiled, certain of his victory. He reached out a hand. Come, Vespera. Let us take the burden from you. Let the archive do its work. Vespera looked at Kaelen's wrist. She saw the ghost link, the interlocking circles that bound them together. She remembered the silver key. She remembered the smell of the Orvan leaf tea and the sound of a man sharpening a knife in the dark. She thought about the way he had looked at her not as a container, but as a person who deserved to choose. She looked at Vane. "He is a murderer," she said, her voice gaining a new, terrifying strength. "But he is a man who remembers his sins. You don't even know what a sin is. To you, everything is just a calculation." The golden light flared into a blinding sun. Vespera's voice changed, echoing with the authority of 1,000 voices. "I am the archive," she cried out, "and I decline the transaction." The specialist lunged. Kaelen moved faster than he had in 20 years. He ducked under the first shock staff, driving his elbow into the specialist's visor. He felt the plastic shatter, the man's muffled cry a secondary concern as he spun toward Vane. But Vane was already retreating, his face a mask of shock. The vault's primary oxygen fans suddenly roared to life, triggered by a command from Vespera's mind. The massive blades began to spin, creating a vortex of freezing air that knocked the specialists off their feet. Kaelen grabbed Vespera, his fingers digging into her arms. "We have to move. The fans will tear the vault apart." The roar was deafening. Kaelen hoisted Vespera over his shoulder, her body vibrating with the raw power of the archive. He scrambled toward the maintenance lift at the far end of the chamber, the wind howling around them like a dying beast. He hit the controls and the lift surged upward just as the first fan blade tore free from its mounting, crashing into the center of the vault with a sound that shook the very foundation of the crucible. They were rising through the dark, the temperature dropping even further as they neared the shuttle bays. Kaelen collapsed against the wall of the lift, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at Vespera, who was curled on the floor, the golden light slowly receding into her skin. She looked at him, her eyes teal again, but filled with a new, somber clarity. "You're not a 0, Kaelen," she whispered. "You're a 1, and that's enough to start a new ledger." Kaelen took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. The ghost link on his wrist felt warm, a steady pulse of connection in a world that wanted to pull them apart. "We're not through yet," he said. "We have 1 mile to go to Shuttle Bay 6, and Vane won't stop at one vault." "I know," she said, her voice firm. "But I know how to talk back to the machines now." Transformation was a painful, jagged thing, Kaelen realized. It was the sound of a man breaking his own rules, and a woman discovering she was the rule breaker. As the lift reached the shuttle tier, he stood up, drawing his knife for the final stretch. The mission wasn't about the data anymore. It wasn't about the past. It was about the next step. "Shuttle Bay 6, he said. "Let's go find our sky." Vespera felt the archive within her like a vast, humming engine, its gears grinding against the fragile architecture of her memories. It was no longer a voice in her head. It was a tide, a relentless surge of information that threatened to wash away the woman named Vespera and replace her with a goddess of pure logic. She could feel the station's grid, every light, every lock, every heartbeat, as if they were extensions of her own nervous system. The walk to Shuttle Bay 6 was a blur of steel and shadows. Kaelen Voss led her with a desperate, focused energy, his hand never leaving hers. He was her anchor in a world made of data floods. Every time she felt herself slipping into the golden hum of the archive, his grip tightened, the rough calluses of his palm pulling her back to the physical, to the moment, to the human. "We're close," Voss whispered, his voice sounding like it was coming from a great distance. "Stay with me, Vespera. 500 meters. Just stay in the room." "I'm trying," she said, her voice echoing with 1,000 digital ghosts. "But it's so loud, Kaelen. The ledger, it's screaming. It knows I'm here. It wants to be deleted." "Then let it scream," he said. "We're not here to fix the station. We're here to save you." They turned a corner and saw the entrance to Shuttle Bay 6. It was a massive circular gate, illuminated by the cold blue light of the security monitors. Standing in front of the gate were 4 retrieval specialists, their hard suits gleaming, their pulse rifles leveled at the center of the corridor. And in the middle of them stood Director Vane. He wasn't smiling anymore. His face was a mask of cold, bureaucratic fury. "End of the line, Inspector," Vane said, his voice echoing through the comlink on the wall. "You have precisely 10 seconds to release the asset before we vent this entire corridor into the vacuum." Kaelen stopped. He looked at the specialists, then at the gate behind them. There was no cover, no way around. He looked at Vespera, his eyes searching hers with a desperate intensity. "Vespera, listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "In my bag, there's a bypass key I took from the registry. It can open the override on the shuttle bay door, but it needs a direct biometric link. It needs the archive." She looked at him, her golden eyes widening. "If I use the archive to open that door, Kaelen, it'll find a way out. It'll spread to the net. It'll be the end of the ledger, but it might be the end of me, too." "I know," he said, his voice breaking, "but it's the only way you get to choose what happens next. You either give it to Vane and become a slave again, or you use it and become something else." Vane's voice crackled again. "5 seconds, Voss." Vespera looked at the specialists. She saw the numbers floating above their heads, their debt balances, their mortality rates, their service contracts. She saw Vane's own ledger, a vast empty void of calculated power. She looked at Kaelen. She saw the man who had bought her for 5 Scrip not to own her, but to give her back to herself. She saw the murderer who was trying to be a man. "I choose," she whispered. She stepped forward, her golden light flaring into a brilliant, blinding aura that filled the corridor. The specialists recoiled, their visors dark lining to protect their eyes. Vane stepped back, his hand shielding his face. Vespera reached out her hand, her fingers splaying as she connected to the station's local network. She didn't use the archive to fight. She used it to speak. "I am Vespera of the Sapphire District." She cried out, her voice a thunderclap that shook the walls. "And I revoke the contract." The archive within her surged, a massive wave of code that flooded the security gates. The monitors flared white, the sounds of 1,000 electronic locks clicking open echoing through the bay. The specialist fired. Kaelen lunged in front of her, his heavy coat absorbing the first pulse bolt. He grunted, the force knocking him back against the wall, but he didn't stop. He drove his resonance wand into the floor plates, triggering a massive static discharge that shorted out the specialist's hard suits. The bay door groaned and began to slide upward. Vespera fell to her knees, the golden light receding into a frantic, jagged emerald pulse. She was gasping for air, her skin covered in a fine electric sweat. "Go!" Kaelen shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the opening. "The shuttle's right there." They scrambled into the bay. It was a vast, echoing space dominated by a single, battered transport shuttle. The engines were already humming, a pre-flight routine triggered by Vespera's burst of data. But Vane was still there. He had pulled a small, silver pistol from his suit, his face contorted with rage. "You think you can just leave?" he screamed, his voice cracking. "You think the Union will let a 10,000 credit asset just fly away?" He leveled the pistol at Vespera's head. Kaelen didn't hesitate. He didn't use his knife or his wand. He used his body. He threw himself at Vane, the 2 men crashing into a pile of industrial crates. The pistol fired. Vespera screamed as she saw Kaelen slump forward, his hand clutching his side. Vane scrambled back, trying to aim again, but Kaelen grabbed his ankle, pulling him down with a strength born of pure desperation. "Get on the ship!" Kaelen roared, his teeth bared in a mask of pain. "Vespera, move!" She ran to him, her hands glowing with a soft, healing emerald. "No, I won't leave you. I'm a murderer, Vespera." He coughed, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "I'm a man who's finished his mission. Now go." She looked at the shuttle, then at the man who was bleeding out on the cold metal floor of the crucible. She thought about the archive. She thought about the power to change the world. She realized then that the most important choice wasn't about the data, it was about the heart. She reached into the archive, one last time. She didn't look for codes to kill or systems to delete. She looked for the one thing the ledger couldn't account for: sacrifice. She focused all of her bioluminescent energy into Kaelen's wound. The emerald light flowed from her fingers like liquid silk, cauterizing the flesh, knitting the muscle back together with the raw, biological power of her kind. The gold in her eyes vanished entirely. The archive's hum in her mind fell silent. She was no longer a goddess. She was just a woman, exhausted and empty. But Kaelen was breathing. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with disbelief. You used it all. The archive, it's gone." "I didn't need it," she whispered, helping him to his feet. "I have you." Vane stood up, his face pale as he looked at the two of them. He raised his pistol again, but his hand was shaking. He looked at the bay door, which was now fully open to the stars. "The ledger is gone," Vespera said, her voice quiet but firm. "I deleted the bond, Vane. I deleted the debt. On the records, we don't exist. We're just ghosts." Vane looked at his own wristcom. The screen was blank. The golden eye of the synaptic union was blind. He lowered the pistol, his shoulders sagging. "You're insane. You'll die out there. You have no money, no identity." "We have choice," Kaelen said, his voice returning to its steady Pathfinder resonance. "And that's a currency you've never understood." They walked toward the shuttle, their footsteps echoing in the vast empty bay. They didn't look back at the director or the iron crucible. They looked forward, at the shimmering nebula that waited for them beyond the gates. They climbed into the cockpit, Kaelen taking the pilot's seat, Vespera sitting beside him. He touched the controls, his fingers moving with a new, light precision. The shuttle lifted off the deck, the thrusters firing with a low, powerful roar. "Where are we going?" Vespera asked as the station began to shrink behind them, a gray pebble in a sea of stars. "I don't know," Kaelen said, looking at the interlocking circles on his wrist. The mark was fading, but the skin underneath felt new. "To the outer rim, I guess. Somewhere where they don't use ledgers." Vespera leaned her head on his shoulder, her emerald hair soft against his coat. She looked at her hands. The glow was gone, replaced by the simple, warm skin of a human being. "I like the sound of that," she said. Transformation was painful, Vespera thought as she watched the iron crucible vanish into the dark. It was the sound of a system breaking and a soul being reborn. It was the weight of a choice that changed everything. They weren't numbers anymore. They weren't 5 Scrip bargains or 10,000 credit assets. They were two ones moving together through the light, and in a universe made of infinite zeros, that was the only thing that truly mattered. The shuttle surged forward, jumping into the jump stream, leaving the debts of the past far behind. The human turned a forced marriage into freedom, not by breaking the bond, but by choosing to keep it on their own terms. And as they vanished into the stars, the resonance of their choice echoed through the dark, a quiet, human song that even the ledger couldn't ignore. The jump stream was not a place of silence. To the uninitiated, the space between stars was a void. But to a man like Kaelen Voss, trained in the delicate art of resonance, it was a cacophony of white noise and temporal static. The stolen shuttle, a battered piece of aerospace junk known as the Wayfarer's Ghost, groaned as the folding engines strained against the curvature of reality. Every bulkhead vibrated with a low-frequency hum that whispered of metal fatigue and ancient, unhealed stresses. Kaelen sat in the pilot's chair, his hands resting lightly on the controls. He wasn't flying the ship so much as he was listening to it. His side ached where the pulse bolt had cauterized his flesh, a tight, puckered knot of scar tissue that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. He looked at his wrist. The ghost link, that interlocking circle of bioluminescent ink that had defined his status as a bondholder, was gone. It had faded into a dull, silvery scar, a phantom limb of a life he had left behind in the iron crucible. Behind him, Vespera moved through the cramped cabin. She was no longer a Bio-Lume in the traditional sense. The emerald fire in her hair had died down to a natural, earthy green, and the golden circuitry that had once mapped the archive onto her skin had vanished completely. She looked human, or as human as any girl from the Sapphire District could look after being sold for 5 Scrip and surviving a corporate purge. She stopped at the small galley, pouring 2 cups of recycled water. She walked to the cockpit and handed one to him. Her fingers were steady, but her eyes, still that haunting, pale teal, carried the weight of a woman who had seen the end of the world and decided to keep walking anyway. "The engines are running hot, Kaelen," she said, her voice missing its digital echo. "We're 4 hours into the jump. How much longer until we drop?" Kaelen took the cup, the warmth of the plastic a grounding sensation. "Another 6 hours. We're heading for a pocket of the outer rim known as the Riftward Territories. It's a messy sprawl of independent mining rocks and scrap stations. No ledger, no synaptic union, just people trying to outrun the vacuum." She sat in the co-pilot's seat, her gaze fixed on the swirling violet tunnels of the jump stream. "I keep waiting for the internal ping," she whispered, "the one that tells me my oxygen tax is due or that my biological maintenance threshold has been exceeded. It's so quiet inside my head, Voss. It's almost terrifying." Kaelen looked at her. He saw the way she clutched her cup, as if afraid it might dissolve if she let go. "For 20 years I lived by the chime of a riscom," he said. "I knew exactly how many credits I had, how many minutes of air I'd earned, and how many miles I had left until retirement. I thought that was safety. I thought if the numbers added up, I was a good man. And now? Now I realize the numbers were just a way to keep me from feeling the resonance of the people I was erasing," he said, his voice dropping into a somber register. "Velana's prime wasn't a mistake of calculation, Vespera. It was a failure of the heart. I looked at 300 families and saw 300 line items. I chose the ledger over the lives because the ledger was easier to live with." Vespera reached out, resting her hand on his forearm. Her touch was different now, not the electric surge of a Bio-Lume, but the simple, honest warmth of skin on skin. "You didn't choose the ledger yesterday," she said. "You chose a 5-script glitch. You chose a woman who had no value left in the system." "I didn't save you to balance the books, Vespera," he said, turning his hand to interlace his fingers with hers. "I saved you because when you stood on that tile, looking at a point over my shoulder, you were the only thing in that entire station that felt real to me. You were the only one who refused to be a zero." Vespera leaned her head back against the seat, a small, tired smile touching her lips. "We're FUBAR, aren't we? No money, no IDs, no home. Just a stolen ship and a jump stream that's probably going to run out of fuel before we hit the rim." Kaelen squeezed her hand. "5 by 5, he said, using the old Pathfinder slang for perfect. "We have everything we need." The ship lurched, a sudden shudder that vibrated through the floor plates. Kaelen's eyes snapped to the sensors. The resonance was changing. The white noise of the jump was being interrupted by a sharp, rhythmic pulsing. "What is it?" Vespera asked, her body tensing. Kaelen adjusted the frequency on his wand, tapping it against the hull. "Someone's pinging us from the exit node. It's a wide-band signal. Not Union. It's too messy." He patched the audio through to the cabin speakers. A voice crackled through the static, rough, gravelly, and sounding like it had been filtered through 1,000 liters of cheap ale. "Unknown vessel, this is Ember's Reach Control. You're coming in hot on a dead man's vector. Identify yourself or prepare to be scavenged. We don't like ghosts in our neck of the woods." Kaelen looked at Vespera. He didn't see an asset or a wife. He saw a partner. "This is Kaelen Voss," he said into the comm, his voice steady. "I'm a resonance inspector with a busted ship and a passenger who's tired of being a number. We're looking for a place to dock where the air is free and the ledger is dead." There was a long silence, broken only by the hiss of the jump stream. "Voss?" the voice said, sounding suddenly surprised. "Kaelen Voss? The Pathfinder who walked away from the frontier regiments?" Kaelen stiffened. "That was a long time ago, Eris." "Eris Thorn," Vespera whispered. "The medic?" The radio crackled with a dry, wheezing laugh. "I told you I'd find a place where the sun doesn't shine, you old warhorse. This is Ember's Reach. We're a scrap heap at the edge of the world, but we're a scrap heap with a sense of humor. Bring her in, Kaelen. We'll keep the lights low and the questions even lower." Kaelen exhaled a breath he felt he had been holding since Sector 9. He looked at Vespera, and for the first time, the pale teal of her eyes reflected a genuine, unburdened hope. "We're dropping in 5 minutes," he said. As the Wayfarer's ghost began its transition back into real space, the violet tunnel of the jump stream shattered into 1,000 diamonds. Ahead of them, the riftward territories appeared, a chaotic, beautiful sprawl of glowing nebula clouds and dark, jagged asteroids tethered together by lines of light. It was a place of ghosts, Kaelen thought. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the resonance. He was part of it. He checked the seal on his side, the scar itching with a new, healthy heat. The immediate aftermath of their escape was a quiet processing of the impossible. They had deleted their pasts. They had survived the Union. They had turned a forced marriage into a shared destiny. And as the ship glided toward the rusted docks of Ember's Reach, Kaelen realized that freedom wasn't a place. It was the weight of the hand in his. Secondary review is over, he whispered. Vespera looked at the scrap station, her face illuminated by the distant stars. Roger that, she said. Let's go find a new ledger. Ember's Reach was a masterpiece of human stubbornness. It was a station built from the carcasses of 100 different ships, held together by magnetic welds, hope, and the sheer refusal of its inhabitants to be categorized. The air here was thick and smelled of ozone, old blankets, and the sharp, spicy aroma of fried root chips. There were no neon signs announcing debt clocks, no security wardens with blue-lit visors, and no glowing marks on the wrists of the people who moved through the narrow, crowded walkways. Kaelen Voss stood on the docking gantry of Level 3, his heavy inspector coat long since discarded. He now wore a simple, dark gray tunic of local weave, his Pathfinder medal no longer hidden in a pocket, but pinned to his chest, not as a rank, but as a reminder. He was 42 years old, and for the first time in his life, he didn't have a schedule. He watched Vespera. She was 20 meters away, standing at a terminal that was actually a community-built cooling system. She wasn't scanning it for data, she was repairing it. Her hands moved with a fluid, natural precision, her emerald hair tied back with a piece of salvaged wire. She had spent the last 2 weeks learning the trade of her father, turning her biological understanding of systems into a mechanical one. A group of children, their faces smudged with dock grease, gathered around her. She didn't look at them as potential labor units. She showed them how to calibrate the thermal sensors, her voice patient and warm. "Hey, Voss!" Eris Thorne called out, hobbling toward him with a crate of medical supplies. "You're staring again. It's bad for the residents." Kaelen looked at the old medic and smiled. "She's good at it, Eris. She doesn't need a Bio-Lume port to understand how things breathe." Eris set the crate down and wiped his brow. "None of us do. We just forgot how to listen because the ledger was always screaming in our ears. Speaking of which, I checked the local nets. The Synaptic Union has officially declared you both KIA in a shuttle malfunction. They've closed the files. 5 Scrip down the drain for them." Kaelen nodded. "A 0 on their books, a 1 on ours." Eris laughed and clapped him on the shoulder. "Exactly. Now get over there and help her with that manifold. It's rattling like a bag of bolts, and I need this sector cool enough to store my antibiotics." Kaelen walked toward Vespera. As he approached, she looked up, her teal eyes bright with a quiet, steady joy. She didn't say a word, just handed him a wrench. He took it, their fingers brushing, a simple human contact that carried more weight than any bond contract ever could. Together, they worked on the machine. They weren't checking manifests. They weren't calculating yields. They were just 2 people making sure their neighbors could breathe. As the sun of the Riftward Nebula began to dip behind the station's horizon, painting the metal walls in shades of bruised purple and gold, Kaelen stepped back. He looked at his hands stained with oil and dust, then at the woman standing beside him. He realized that his transformation wasn't a sudden event. It was a series of choices, each one a brick in a foundation he had never known he was building. He was no longer a man who lived by the numbers. He was a man who lived by the resonance of the people he chose to love. "I spent 40 years thinking that a life could be measured in Scrip and air minutes. I thought that if I kept my ledger in the black, I was safe from the darkness. I was a man of cold logic, a man who could look at a town burning and see only a loss of infrastructure. I thought that by making myself a number, I was protecting myself from the pain of being a person. But as I stand here on this rusted rock at the edge of the universe, I realize that the only thing that ever truly mattered was the 5 Scrip I didn't have to spend. It wasn't about the money. It was about the moment I stopped calculating and started feeling the weight of another soul. I spent my life looking for structural failures in hull plates, but I missed the failure in my own heart. It took a woman with emerald hair and a broken contract to show me that freedom isn't the absence of a ledger. It's the choice of whose name you write in it. I am no longer an inspector of cargo. I am a guardian of the things that can't be weighed. I am a ghost, and for the first time, I am finally solid." He looked at Vespera, who was watching the distant stars. She turned to him, her face calm and beautiful in the fading light. "Voss?" she asked. "What are you thinking about?" "I'm thinking about the price of things," he said. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. And? And I think 5 Scrip was the best bargain in the history of the galaxy. She laughed, a clear, ringing sound that echoed through the gantry. As they stood there, two ghosts in a world of iron, Kaelen felt the resonance of the station around them, the heartbeat of 1,000 choices, 1,000 lives, all interconnected, all valuable, all uncounted. I have spent my life in a world where everything had a price, and everyone was a debt waiting to be collected. I wonder, in your own world of numbers and schedules, have you ever found something, or someone, whose value was so high it made the math disappear? What is the one choice you would make if the ledger no longer mattered? He reached out and took her hand, interlacing his fingers with hers. He didn't look at his wrist. He didn't check the time. He just stood there, breathing the free air of the rim. Vespera turned her hand over, squeezing his. "Let's go home, Kaelen," she said. And they walked together into the crowded, noisy heart of the station, leaving no footprints on the ledger, only memories in the dark. The emerald glow was gone, but as they moved through the shadows, a small, stubborn light remained between them, a warmth that even the vacuum of space could never chill.